Hello, I'm Cecilia Frigakis, and I am joined by Eric Murphy Selinger, a professor of English in the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. His research interests include issues of love, desire, and literary pleasure, which he explores in modern poetry and in popular romance fiction, as well as international romantic film. He is the executive editor of the online Journal of Popular Romance Studies and is a founding member of the International Association for the Studies of Popular Romance. Thank you for spending time with us today, Dr. Selinger.
Happy to do it. Glad to talk to you.
All right, to start, what got you interested in romance novels as an area of study? Did you just start off as like a fan/reader?
Yeah, so I started reading romance novels back in about 1999. I started with Bridget Jones' Diary, and I read it because my wife had read it and absolutely loved it. And we had an infant daughter that was giving us no end of trouble. And I really needed a break sometimes. And I needed to read something that wasn't connected to my research. I had gotten to the point, I was hired as a poetry scholar, and I had gotten to the point where reading poetry for pleasure had gotten somewhat difficult because every time I read poetry, I found myself shifting into professional mode and thinking about how would I teach this? Would I put it on a syllabus? What would students think? And so on. So I wanted to read something that was as far from that as I could get. And I'd always been a reader of other forms of popular fiction, science fiction, fantasy. It's what I grew up on, detective fiction when I was in college. And read the Bridget Jones and went to my public library, and they had a flyer that said, if you like Bridget Jones' Diary, try these. And so we started working our way down through the list. And one of the first books, maybe the top book on the list, was a novel called The Boyfriend School by Sarah Bird, which is sort of a metafictional novel. The heroine is a romance author. And within the novel, there's a lot of discussion about this genre and why it has such a bad reputation and why people, have put it down. That's the same thing as bad reputation. And that got me thinking, like, wait a minute, I've always thought of myself as somebody that had pretty, open tastes as far as the media that I enjoy. And yet here's this whole realm of writing that I've never looked into, walked right past it at the library and the bookstore as though it just wasn't registering. And I found that not only interesting, but somewhat disturbing, because my scholarship on poetry was, a lot of it was about love poetry. And here was this whole world of novels about love that I hadn't paid any attention to. So I started reading, and I loved the books. They brought me so much pleasure and were such a relief and gave me just a real sense of optimism and possibility at a time when I kind of needed it. And it was about 4 or 5 years before I had the thought that I could bring them into my research and into my teaching. For a while, they were just a refuge from all of that. But then in the early 2000s, I began to think that if these books had brought me this much pleasure, that was something that I wanted to share with students. And also I had begun reading the scholarship on popular romance. And I thought, I seem to be reading these books in a way that's a little different from what previous scholars have done. Maybe there's some room here for me to make a contribution on that front as well. So that was where that all began in about 2005, and I've been doing it ever since.
Okay, that was very interesting. What is your opinion on books to movies such as Bridget Jones' Diary?
Well, I mean, when they're done well, I like them. And when they're not done well, I don't like them. It's a hard thing to do. I have tremendous respect for the people who managed to pull this off, right? So Bridget Jones' Diary, I thought, I love the film, and I've watched it far too many times. I once had a student at the end of a quarter come up to me and say, I just want you to know that every single week this quarter, you have dropped some Bridget Jones' Diary film quote into our class. And I guess that's true. I don't know. I just do it a lot. But there are a lot of them that really don't work. There are a lot of them that mistake having attractive people in the cast for having chemistry between those people. And that's something that doesn't just magically happen. There are, choices that get made that show that the people doing the adaptation haven't paid attention to, the novel's voice, the novel's kind of tone and quality. They're just focused on plot points. They're just focused on replicating, scenes or bits of dialogue. And, one of the things that the novels do is bring you into characters' heads, and film can't do that. It's a totally different medium. And so, hats off to them when they do it well. It's certainly good publicity for books that I love, and it brings students into my class, so I'm grateful for that. But it's a lot tougher, I think, than maybe we sometimes give folks credit for.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back a little bit to the common perception of romance novels being seen as like a guilty pleasure, but yet they're such an immensely popular genre of literature that it's consumed by like millions, if not billions of people. What do you think about that contradiction?
I actually don't think it's a contradiction. I think the popularity is part of the reason for the disparagement. Right? It's a sad but true thing that as mass literacy develops, and as publishing begins to fill the marketplace with texts that are there for working class readers, for readers that haven't gone through elite education and so on. There's a lot of anxiety out there. You get a lot of novelists, for example, in the late 19th century, who are really concerned that their chosen art form hasn't been and won't be taken seriously as art because there's just so much of it out there that is appealing to the lowest common denominator of reader, or is appealing to female readers, or is appealing to less educated readers. I mean, all of these words are there. And so you get, a novelist like Henry James, for example, who would really love to be a bestseller, but is also sort of horrified by what that would mean for his art, and for the medium that he's working in, and who tries very hard to distinguish the art novel from mass market writing. One of the things that's always striking to me when I teach romance novels in my classes is that I have students, English majors, who define themselves in part by what they don't read. They have a sense that to be an English major is to be somebody who likes this and not that. And so I think part of my job as a professor is to trouble that distinction a little bit, to get people to realize that reading for pleasure is an activity that spans high art and popular media, high art and popular forms, that there's a lot of really interesting thinking that can happen when you are reading something that may be packaged as a guilty pleasure. The only pleasures I tend to feel guilty about are the ones that I haven't enjoyed enough. It seems to me that there's no reason to lump vast numbers. Number one, there's no reason to lump these vast numbers of texts all together and treat them as though they're all the same as each other, because they're not. And number two, I mean, there are a lot of things that I don't enjoy, but I don't see any particular reason to pat myself on the back for not liking things that other people do like. That's diversity of taste. It has to do with upbringing. It has to do with education. It has to do with family dynamic. I mean, you go down that rabbit hole, you'll never get out. So yeah, but as I say, I think part of the reason for the disparagement is precisely that. The books are too popular with too many people, and particularly the wrong kind of people. And it's been that way for a very long time.
Are you surprised by what people find romantic?
uh, Probably. I'm trying to think of an example here. I mean, certainly there. I mean, so let me try to take the question in a couple of different directions, right? On the one hand, if I'm thinking like a scholar, right, I think to myself, there are poems, stories, gestures, cultural forms from times and places around the world and across history that were thought of as romantic in that time and place that really do not seem that way to me. I used to teach a class on love poetry that we would read, in which we would read Dante's Vita Nuova, right? A classic work of the literature of love about Dante and Beatrice. But to me, there's nothing romantic about the story, that sees her across a crowded church when they're 9 years old, and then he sees her again 9 years later. They never exchange a word, or barely a word. I mean, there's a whole cultural structure there that says this is love and this is romantic that I am foreign to, or it's foreign to me. So from that perspective, yeah, there are a lot of things that in different times and places people have thought romantic that kind of either leave me cold or make me wince. And you don't have to go that far back to find them. And then of course, within contemporary culture, you can always find, somebody's video of a proposal or something like that, where you watch it and you think, oh my God, no, don't do that. Don't do this. Who thought this was a good idea? Which on the one hand I suppose is a different thing, but on the other hand, maybe it's not, because what it points to is the proliferation, the layering, the simultaneity of lots of different discourses of love, lots of different models of what love is, that coexist in contemporary culture, and that they don't map easily onto one another. And if you're working within one frame of reference, someone from outside of that can look in and say, dude, what were you thinking?
It's a difficult question, but a good answer nonetheless. So one of your areas of interest is the different ways that love and romance are represented in popular culture across the world. So generally speaking, how much of what a person considers romantic is defined by where they're from, and how much of it is actually universal?
I don't know that I can answer that in any actually scholarly way. And I say that because to me, that seems like a question that somebody from the social sciences or, would be more qualified to answer. I mean, I can say that when I watch, romantic dramas or comedies from other parts of the world, often I feel very comfortable watching them, and I feel like, okay, I don't feel like I'm really missing something. I feel like the sort of gestural vocabulary, the emotional landscape here is one that I quite recognize. Now, is that because there's some kind of universal human experience being tapped into, or is it just a product of globalization, that this is international media? This is media that is not just aimed at a local market and happens to appear on my, television here in the United States, but rather, this is a Netflix original show that happens to be part of, the Korean broadcast ecosystem, but is also part of the US one and the Chinese one and European one, and it's in Turkey and, so on and so on. I tend to think that when we talk about love, we are talking about something that is profoundly universal and probably, biological in its lowest stratum, but that is inflected by culture kind of all the way up as it makes its way from whatever that longing to be with another person, that longing for association, is like, all the way up to a song, a poem, a story, etc. But honestly, for a real answer to that, you'd want to talk to people who have actually done that research. I've profited from the research that's been done on that, but it's not what I do myself. I just read the books.
Yeah. To make it more lighthearted, I figured we could play a few rounds of dump, date, and marry with pieces of romantic popular culture. So between like the three choices I'll say, you'll say what you want to dump, to date, or to marry. So
Okay.
to start, we're going to start with Shakespearean plays, Romeo and Juliet, The Taming of the Shrew, or Much Ado About Nothing.
Ooh, that's a tough one. I'm gonna dump Taming of the Shrew. I'm gonna date Romeo and Juliet, and I'm gonna marry Much Ado About Nothing for Beatrice and for Benedict and Beatrice.
All right. So between these three movies, which would you want to dump, date, or marry? It's Casablanca, Titanic, and The Notebook.
Dump The Notebook, date Titanic, marry Casablanca.
Okay.
No question.
All right. Between these three books, which would you want to dump, date, or marry? Pride and Prejudice, Outlander, or Twilight?
Ooh, I'm gonna get in trouble with this one. Okay, I'm gonna marry Pride and Prejudice. That's easy. But the other two, I'm gonna dump Outlander and I'm gonna date Twilight. And I say that because when I read Outlander and when I read Twilight, it took me a couple of goes to get all the way through Outlander. It did not captivate me, and Twilight was about 2 sittings. So, yep, I'll stick by it.
Good answer. And lastly, with songs, Unchained Melody by the Righteous Brothers, I Will Always Love You by Whitney Houston, and God Only Knows by the Beach Boys.
Ooh. I don't think I know God Only Knows by the Beach Boys. I'm embarrassed to say. So sorry, Beach Boys. I'm dumping that one. Now, what does that leave me with? Unchained Melody and I Will Always Love You. I'm going to date I Will Always Love You, and I'm going to marry Unchained Melody.
So going back to some more questions, in addition to being a teacher and an academic, you are also a poet. So are your poems typically about love?
Ooh, well, no, hang on. I am a former poet. I am a recovering poet. I haven't written a poem in a very long time. And by that, I'm talking 30 years. So they were. I was. I wrote poetry up through the 90s, into the 90s. Stopped writing around the time that I came here to DePaul. I don't think those two things are related. I do not want to suggest that they were. I would say, I mean, more seriously, I think a lot of the ideas that I've worked with as a scholar of love were things that they were insights that came to me back in the days when I was writing poetry. They were lines, they were topics, they were things that I had learned from reading poems that made their way first into my own poetry. And then as I became a scholar of love and love literature, I found ways to explore those ideas by talking about other people's poetry. That's my first book was about love in American poetry. That was what my dissertation research was about. That was the work that I did as a scholar for a pretty long time. And so I see it not so much as just one thing ending and another thing starting up. I see it very much as a kind of natural progression. And frankly, in my classes, even as recently as last week, talking about some songs and poems in my Honors 101 class, I find myself saying things about love and rhetoric, for example, about the use of hyperbole in love songs. And I think back to myself, yeah, I can remember a poem that I wrote probably my senior year in college or shortly thereafter, where that idea kind of came to me and made its way into verse. And here I am, 30 years later, turning it into something that I'm teaching students who are about the age that I was when that came to me as a poem. So that's not a bad trajectory.
All right. Lastly, who are some of your current favorite writers? And then can you recommend anything for us to add to our read list?
Oh, gosh, that's fun. So let's see, current favorites. Well, I'm a big fan of a British romance novelist named Alexis Hall. I've taught his work for a lot of years now. In fact, I'll be teaching one of his novels starting next week in my Honors 101 class, a novel called Glitterland, which is just a beautiful novel. And everything I've read by him, I've loved. I recently taught a historical romance class that ended with a novel called The Care and Feeding of Waspish Widows by Olivia Waite, which was, in that class, it was one of the few female romance novels that we read. Older protagonists, women in their 40s, historical romance. Just loved it. Found it I found a very moving text and found it a really interesting text. It worked really well in the classroom, opened up some very interesting discussions about the relationship between love and friendship, opened up some great discussions about generational stuff playing out in the novel, where for the first time we were reading characters who, not quite the age of my students' parents, but close to it, and that kind of, and who are parents themselves, and that kind of added a whole dimension to the novel. So I really enjoyed that. We recently, in a literature cultures class that I'm teaching right now in the English department, we recently read a very fun book called Sophia Khan is Not Obliged, which came out about 6 years ago by a British writer named Aisha Malik, which was billed as a work of hijabi chick lit, and it certainly works that way. And my students who are Bridget Jones fans had a lot of fun of kind of picking up on the chick lit side of the novel and exploring that. It's also, I think, a really interesting novel about the sort of conflicting desires that we have surrounding love, both for it to be something that we can rationally understand and approach in a kind of sensible fashion, making good decisions about partners and relationships and whatnot, and that sort of ongoing or continuing desire for it to be something that is kismet, something that's magical, something that enchants us and sweeps us off our feet and is not subject to reason and rational analysis. And so in the context of reading a novel that's simply a lot of fun, you're also getting the chance to think about a lot of really interesting and intricate ideas that the novel suspends and refuses to take sides on in a way that I find really delightful. So that's three, and there are a lot more. There are a lot of these books out there, part of the fun of discovering the romance genre in my 30s was realizing, oh my God, there's a whole world of authors and texts out there that I never knew about, that I could spend the rest of my professional life immersed in. And that's pretty much what I've been doing. So it's worked out for me.
All right, that's all the questions that I have. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Selinger. Where can viewers learn more about you and your work?
Well, they can follow me on Twitter at Selinger Eric. They can swing by the Journal of Popular Romance Studies, where, as you mentioned in the intro, I've been the editor since we started just over a decade ago. And that is a peer-reviewed, double-blind, peer-reviewed journal, but it is an open access journal, so anybody can read without subscription. All of the scholarship that's over there and the editor's notes and other things that I've been posting over there. I'd say those are two good places to begin.
All right, thank you.
And take my classes.